Start with a 2-inch piece of square wire, preferably annealed, because that will make it easier to bend, and shape it roughly into a pear shape. If you have flat nose pliers, you can shape it a little easier, keep it flat. I'm just making sure that one side stays up. Okay, you bring it up like that and you see it kind of meets. So what you're going to want to do, though, to make a good solder joint is to file both sides of this. So you're going to file them flat. Sides are finished, they'll meet. So now they meet neatly. Next thing you're going to want to do is solder it. I've already got a little bit of solder here on the side, but I'm going to cut a little bit more. You see I have little strips cut in. If you hold your finger against it and cut, then the chips don't fly away. See? Hold against and cut. Okay. Now, normally I would use a solder pick, and I'll show that a little later, but to start out, the easiest thing to do for a beginner is to use very small, fine solder tweezers and pick up a chip and put it right there on the tip. Then you light your torch and you move around the whole piece. Heating it up, and then you start to focus more on that one spot, and then it will just go and solder. Then we take tweezers, pickle tweezers, and dip it in the acid, the pickle, and then rinse it in the water. So now we have the centerpiece for this. Now, the next step is we're going to take a bezel cup, which is going to hold our stone, and we're going to make a little bit of a file mark. I see this has bent up a little bit anyway, so I'm just going to make it a little bit, make sure it's flat. See? Then we're going to take the file and we're going to file a flat spot. This will give more contact space. When soldering these two together. Okay. Now, normally I would put the solder, normally I would definitely use the solder pick here. We're going to do it a little differently. We're going to move it away. We're going to put the chip, well, maybe even a couple of chips on the edge here. Make sure it's fluxed. And we're going to heat it up again, and hopefully will get the solder up on the end of this little piece of metal. And this is the solder pick. I'm just having it here in case, but you see one piece already went up there, and the other piece did too. Now, as long as it's not too nasty from soldering, you can do this. You can go ahead and reflux it. Bring your cup up. Make sure it's fluxed. And again, heat the whole thing. The solder pick is useful, even if you don't use it as for solder, for nudging things into place. And looks like it's soldered, but I'm not sure it's soldered all the way through. Let's see. Yes, it did. So then we pick that up in the pickle. And what the pickle does is it cleans off most of the oxidation every time. So this is the framework we're going to be using. Okay. The next step is we're going to make some filigree. Now, after I've been doing this for so long, I mostly just do things by freehand, but this is a good tool for when you're starting out. It's just a piece of metal with different marks on it so that you can make pieces the same size. See, we're going to cut these two pieces. Like that, and we're going to make two plain spirals. The trick with making good spirals is not forcing the shape with the pliers, but using the tension in the wire and your fingers to guide it around the tips of the pliers. One of those is going to go there, and one of these is going to go on the other side. If you need to, you can always pick up the two pieces and put them on top of each other to see how close they are. These are pretty close there, but they're one's a little bit longer than the other, so we can trim them. There we go. So that's the first bits of filigree we're going to include. Again, we're going to take the tweezers and we're going to put a solder chip on each spot that we're going to solder. Like that. And I've already fluxed it. So now, again, big sweeps first. And unfortunately, I'm currently using regular flux with no denatured alcohol, so this demonstrates the reason for using denatured alcohol is that it doesn't boil up and displace your pieces as easily. But I'm out of it. sometimes you don't always get the solder to flow the way you want it to, so you have to pick up a new piece, and that's where the solder pick comes in handy, because then you don't have to stop and start over. See? And pick it up in the acid. If it's a little too dark, you might even leave it there for a minute. So we're just going to check. Not everything's soldered, so we'll get this on the next one. Sometimes that happens. You can put that there. And one thing that can happen, there's a good bit of solder right between the setting and the main body. Sometimes you can coax the existing solder to remelt and come toward the flame, which I just did. Now we're going to take another couple of pieces of filigree wire the same size and do the same thing, but put it above the two that are already there. So again, shape, shape, that, okay. Can make sure they're the same length, pretty close, a little bit longer because of the bend on one. And again, we're going to make two spirals. You see, I'm using my left hand, the fingers, to shape it. The pliers barely move. Okay. You see, if you look here, I barely actually use the pliers. I get the initial loop around it, and then I use my fingers and keep the pliers relatively still. Okay. Again, you can kind of measure them against each other, and they match up. And we're going to just put it in like that. Same thing, flux it, and then we're going to get the tweezers and put the solder chips in place. See, there's one more. This one, the piece blew over, so we're just going to move it with the solder pick. And that will adhere. I'm not sure this one actually connected. There it did. One of my curves or spirals got a little bit bent when I was trying to move it, but as long as it's not too bad, you can just straighten it up with your pliers. we're well on our way to having a pendant. Next, we're going to make 4 slightly shorter ones. So I'm going to use this length here and just try to mark it with your finger. Put a nice little crisp bend in it. And we are going to try to make 4 of the little curves. If you need to, you can always use your flat nose pliers to straighten out the ends and line them up to make sure they're about the same length. And if you need to, you can just cut across. Just try to get them as lined up as possible. These are pretty good. A little bit of difference isn't going to make much difference, but you can still trim it. So we're going to make 4 smaller spirals. Again, you're mostly using your fingertips far more than you are the pliers. The pliers are an anchor point. Make that nice inner loop tight and use your fingers to swirl it around. If it bends a little strange, you can always go back and adjust it. It's a little bit bigger. Try to make them as similar as you can, but we're going to be using them in pairs, so if they're not all 4 exactly alike, we'll take 2 and 2 of the most alike. So, let's see. These 2 are both a little bit longer. This one's closer to the other one. I'm just going to make a small adjustment with my fingers. And I think what we'll do is we will take these 2. You can use your tweezers if you find it too awkward to do it with your fingers. And move that one into place. And this one into place, and then these are going to go this way. Turn this one around. So, we may not get it all soldered this in one go, but we'll give it a shot. Flux it and your solder in place, please. Remember, you have to do all the joints, especially the ones on the curves that could get snagged otherwise. There may actually be plenty of solder in the inner joint here, but I'm still going to put some on. And these last ones are a little harder to get at, but you can always put them on the side and use the torch to draw the solder the right direction. Okay, may have to do more than one time here. But again, you heat it up. Again, if it moves, just use your solder pick. to kind of push it back in. This often happens. There's one. Okay, I think that went. That one. And those went into place. But let me see. We're going to wait and do these last ones with a second time, and I'll show you why. We need to get them to actually sit right. Oops, one of them didn't solder. Okay. Actually, two of them didn't solder. I thought they did. That's what happens usually when you're doing this, is sometimes things don't solder and you have to do it again. Okay. Still, we're only going to worry about the straight end of the curve right now, getting that soldered into place. Old habits. Went to use the solder pick instead. Okay, we got that one soldered. And this one moved a little bit, so that's one of the ways you can use the solder pick. There we go. Now, the reason why we didn't do the bottom ones is because it was harder to get around that setting. So sometimes if you have the points anchored, you can then adjust it yourself and get it close and even around the piece, around the setting. See? Now I'm going to show you actually the other way to use the solder pick here. And that is, instead of putting your solder chip right in place, you pick it up with the tip of your solder pick. You keep both the tip and the solder, and when the solder starts to ball up, now you can finish it off a number of ways. In this case, I'm going to use a finished bail that I already have, but you're going to need to file this a little bit flat. And then you need to make sure the end of the bail is also flat. Okay. Then we're going to line them up here. Let's see, there's something in the way there. Excuse me while it's out of sight for a second. You can always put the solder in place as usual, like that. And be prepared to grab more with your solder pick if necessary. We're going to heat it up. So here's the problem. The solder doesn't always go where you want it to. And sometimes things move when you're soldering. Okay, grab some more solder. Now, that's all soldered up. We're going to add one more little decoration, and that is a decorative ball. You can use any little scrap of silver. You can use a piece you melted, for example, trying to solder. I have, for example, a stone setting that I ruined. Just flux it and heat it up until it melts. It will naturally form a ball. And if you're using a brick like this, it should make a flat side on it. Now if it's a little too big, you can even take your solder tool, your solder pick, and split it. Like that. I'll let that cool for a second. I'm just going to grab these little tweezers and quench it. And we are going to put this right up where the bail is. This has two purposes. One is it strengthens the connection between the body and the bail, but it also covers up what can sometimes be a sloppy solder joint. So you already have quite a bit of solder there. If you need to, you can add more with a solder pick, but first we're going to try to use the solder that's already there. Heating it. Until it remelts. You can kind of see it move now. I've ended up moving my bail a little bit, so this is where the solder pick comes in handy. Okay. Always comes in handy to show that the expert isn't perfect either. There we go. Yep. To set the stone, you put it in the bezel cup and use a bezel or burnisher and just kind of go around the edge, getting it pushed up against the stone. If you want to, you can put a little drop of glue in, like crazy glue, and let it sit, especially if the stone is slightly smaller than the bezel cup. It just keeps it centered. And there you have the basic. You can go over the little bits here with rubber wheels. You kind of clean up anything that's messed up, or globs of solder. I'm just taking away some solder there. And a little bit down here. And that looks pretty good. And before you do any real polishing, if you have a Dremel or a flexi shaft, to use one of these steel brushes and just lightly go in on all the filigree and just kind of get the stuff out of the nooks and crannies.